Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we're focusing on soda taxes and experience of implementation from mainly Europe, but also around the world. This is the first of a series of webinars that we're going to be holding, thanks to some operating grants from the European Union's Third Health Programme. And all of these webinars are going to be focused on policy issues linked to obesity. So this one on soda tax is our first, and our next one's going to be on marketing. So look out for save the date for that one shortly. So health taxes are a very hot topic at the moment, particularly as we prepare for the UN high-level meeting, which is taking place 2 weeks today. The meeting is going to be a really good opportunity for heads of states from all over the world to make commitments towards addressing non-communicable diseases and hopefully to commit to implementing fiscal policies to address the burden of NCDs in their country, including obesity. So we're all hoping that we're going to have some positive outcomes from that meeting. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. So we're going to start with an introductory presentation from Robert Martin and from Bryony Sinclair and Fiona Singh from the World Cancer Research Fund International, who are going to talk about the state of implementation of soda taxes across Europe. And then we're going to move on to 3 very interesting presentations, which are case studies from 3 countries around the world where we've had implementation already, and hopefully we can get some learnings from them. You should all be muted, so if you can just make sure that you are to prevent any feedback. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat function, which hopefully you've all found. We will have about 10 minutes per speaker, and assuming they don't go over, we'll have about 5 minutes for every speaker for you to ask any questions. And then at the end, we'll have some more time for some Q&A. So yeah, just please ask your questions in the chat box and we'll try and get them answered. So I'm pleased today to hand you over to Robert Martin, who's our first speaker. He's from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he's going to be asking the question, why do we want to have soda taxes? Why are they important? So I'm just going to give him control now, and over to you, Robert.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Hannah, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm delighted to be here, and now I can see there's 31 people joined, so I'm glad to be here and to be able to speak with so many of you. I'm going to try to present for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we should have, I think, another 5 or some minutes afterwards for questions and discussion. So to start, I've been asked to discuss why should European countries adopt sugar taxes, and I've put the kind of European in parentheses there because really my presentation I think is somewhat generic and really about why should any country or geography adopt sugar taxes. So moving forward here. Oops. There we go. Oops. So to start, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to first start with why countries should adopt taxes. I'm going to then talk about some lessons from tobacco and alcohol taxes. And then I'm going to conclude with some discussion about how industry interferes and seeks to block taxes, and then just kind of an outlook for the future. So first and foremost, why should countries adopt sugar taxes? Goes without saying, they improve health. And I think, this is probably the most compelling reason why countries, states, and cities should adopt taxes. We know for sugar taxes that sugar consumption is a major contributor to being overweight and or obese. We know that high BMI is estimated to claim at least 4 million lives each year. Of course, we also know that sugar consumption is linked to diabetes and many other health challenges. So first and foremost, again, reducing sugar consumption benefits health. And we know that sugar taxes reduce consumption of sugar and sugar-sweetened beverages. So again, first and foremost, the taxes improve health. Another reason why they should be adopted is that they raise revenues for governments. And these revenues can, not necessarily always are, but they can be reinvested into health programs, and particularly into health programs that support and promote. Sorry, could we go back for a second? Slides. For some reason, the slides have advanced. There we go. So again, it's not only that the taxes improve health, but they raise revenues for governments, and these revenues can also be used to improve equity. So next slide. Now, a lot of, I think, the momentum and interest around sugar-sweetened beverage taxes has come from the experience from tobacco and alcohol taxes. Now, tobacco taxes, I think, are probably one of the most compelling interventions that we have in public health, maybe even in public policy. Economists have really endorsed them as one of the most important things that can be done to save lives. We know from the experience, and I know Pamela's going to speak about the South African experience in more depth later, but you know, simply said, between 1993 and 2003, in 10 years, we saw about a 40% decrease in tobacco consumption because of tax. More recently in the Ukraine, we saw a 20% reduction in the proportion of the population who smoked tobacco daily between 2010 and 2017. We see similar results with alcohol. In Finland, in 2003, alcohol-related mortality increased by 16% among women and by 31% among women when the country reduced taxes. So again, we can see a very serious impact on consumption. And emerging evidence from Mexico shows that a sugar tax reduced sugar-sweetened beverage sales by 5% in the first year, with an almost 10% reduction in the second year. So again, we can see that, you know, kind of from tobacco through alcohol, now into sugar, that taxes work in reducing consumption. Despite this evidence, we see continued interference from industry. We see industry blocking taxation efforts by lobbying policymakers, by exaggerating the industry's economic value, and generally undermining the evidence. Most recently, we saw this in the discussions in Montevideo around the high-level NCD process. We saw this again a few months ago in the high-level WHO Commission on NCDs, where beverage industry was able to infiltrate the US government's position and effectively block progress or consensus in the report to endorse a sugar-sweetened beverage tax. So despite this, or perhaps, again, because this evidence, we see industry engaging to try to block taxation efforts. Nevertheless, I think there are reasons to be optimistic. Despite the NCD Commission's vacillation, WHO still recommends sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, and most importantly, countries and cities are adopting them, and they're continuing to adopt them. And I think if you look at this next slide, there we go. In terms of sugar taxes worldwide, we already see that 28 countries and 7 US cities so far have adopted sugar taxes. And if you look there, you see quite a number of countries within Europe. I would expect this map to expand in the coming months and years, as many other countries have already begun to discuss and consider the possibilities around a sugar sweetened beverage tax. So I think there are many reasons to be optimistic, and with the implementation of further taxes, we have greater evidence, which is again beginning to compel policymakers to adopt sugar sweetened beverages. So finally, I would just say that, you know, I think there's growing understanding, growing recognition of the effectiveness of taxes. Most recently, I was able to participate in a group of about 25 policymakers from UN agencies, from civil society, from academics, to endorse not only sugar sweetened beverages taxes, but in a package which is focused also on tobacco and alcohol taxes. So, oops, we could just get the slides back. Oh, well, possible to get those slides. There we go. Thank you. So most recently, yes, we were able to publish this article on looking at sugar, tobacco, and alcohol taxes together. And I think there's kind of growing optimism, growing recognition of their role in helping to improve health and as a way to raise resources. So I'm going to end there, and I'm looking forward to your questions and discussion. So thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Robert. It's very interesting to have that oversight of why we're talking about soda tax. I think sometimes we focus on what's been done and kind of forget to go back to basics almost. So I'm just waiting to see if any questions come through. I actually have a question myself that I want to ask, and you made a comparison to alcohol and tobacco taxes and how there's been progress there. And I was just wondering where you see governments currently sitting in terms of whether they recognise that sugar or just sugar sweetened beverages, sort of, are they as harmful? Do they see that? Is that why we maybe not got as much progress as we would like? Is it just the fact that they don't get that we should be taxing these products, or are there other factors at play?
Mm-hmm. No, thanks for the question, Hannah. I mean, I think it is for governments a no-brainer to tax tobacco and alcohol, and I think governments are increasingly aware that it's a no-brainer to tax soda or sugar-sweetened beverages. I think, unfortunately, that awareness isn't where we want it to be yet, but I think it's growing, and I think, you know, that's a kind of a reason why these sorts of discussions and kind of advocacy efforts are so important, because I think we need to help policymakers realize that soda and sugar sweetened beverages are in the kind of same realm as tobacco and alcohol. And I think we've seen progress there, where we have more progress to do and to make, but I think we're kind of on that path. I think the tricky thing is that even, and you see this with tobacco particularly, even though we have, you know, overwhelming, compelling evidence of its effectiveness, I think in the 2017 World Tobacco Atlas, WHO shared that it was only about 10% of countries that have actually implemented tobacco taxes at the recommended level. So even with an intervention that we know is compellingly effective, policymakers are unable to implement them at the levels required. And I think that's a reflection of the interference from the industry. And so I think we need to anticipate that same level of interference from the industry on soda and sugar sweetened beverage taxes.
Okay, thank you for that. We've had another question come in actually. What do you think NGOs can do to encourage governments to tax sugar? I know we've got quite a few listening, so I think that would be helpful if you could.
Yeah, no, perfect. And thank you for that question. Now I can see the chat actually. Okay, this is great. I feel like it's almost a little more virtual. I find these presentations are always a little bit difficult because you can't see anyone's faces. So it's nice to be able to see the chat there. I think NGOs can do a lot of things to encourage governments to tax. I think, first and foremost, NGOs can help raise awareness of the threats. So, bringing the kind of attention to the issue. I think they can highlight and profile other examples. I think they can also kind of make the case of the benefits. And I think, governments, when they see not only the health benefits, but the benefits of raising revenue, I think that's quite compelling. And I think NGOs can make a lot of noise about these sorts of things.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, we've got another question here. Is there an explanation for why the sugar tax reduced SSB sales more in the second year compared to the first year? I'm guessing this might be referring to Mexico.
That's a great question. I have to confess, I don't know the specifics on that. I'm not familiar enough with the Mexico case to be able to speak to that.
Okay. We've just had a very long question come in that I'm just trying to digest at the moment. What I suggest I do is send you this information and put you in touch with a participant who's commented. So it looks a bit long to discuss right now. So I'll send you that information. I'm sorry to the person who's just sent that through. I'm just waiting to see if there's any other questions come in. Oh, we've got one here about whether or not I think we should be focusing efforts on sugar more broadly, or whether soda specific is the right approach.
Right. No, I think that's a really good question and a really tough question. I mean, I think right now the momentum is certainly around soda taxes. I think and I think the reason for that is because it's a little bit easier to kind of comprehend and easier to implement potentially. I think a kind of broader sugar tax has been tougher to conceptualize and tougher to design. I think there's probably possibilities for that in the future, but I think probably for now, the focus and advocacy should be around soda taxes. But I think that's actually kind of a live discussion. I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists and other participants think about this, because I think this is actually a very strategic question.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful as well. So one more question that I'll ask, I think, before we move on. So I've had a question here. In Australia, there is a complete lack of political will for a sugar-sweetened beverage tax from both major political parties, despite strong and increasingly frequent lobbying from the public health sector. What are some critical factors that we need in order to get an SSB tax onto the policy agenda?
No, that's a great question, and I think the Australian case is really interesting. I mean, I hope excuse me, that there could be some policymakers within Australia that are favorable or amenable or open to discussing this. And I think one needs to kind of identify them, target them, and then support them to make their case. I think where we've seen this move forward is usually with starting with academics, but then quickly you need policymakers that really become kind of champions for this and open for this. And so I think if there are individual policymakers within Australia that are open or kind of conducive to this, that they should be supported and their efforts amplified. And if it's not kind of current policymakers, maybe it's retired policymakers. And if that's not possible, I mean, I think we've seen in other countries sometimes kind of celebrities might be helpful. And these can be either, again, former politicians, or even maybe former athletes, or people that have kind of a certain amount of gravitas within the public.
Thank you very much for that response, Robert, and thank you very much for joining us today. Your presentation, as I said, was very interesting. Unfortunately, Robert is going to have to leave before the end of the webinar today. So if you do have any other questions for him, please get in touch with World Obesity and we can hopefully put you in touch to continue the discussions beyond this webinar. I'm now going to pass over to Bryony Sinclair and Fiona Singh from WCRF International, who are going to be talking through some of the current implementation across Europe, as well as some key learnings for policy implementation that they have identified in a recent Momentum publication, which focuses on soda taxes.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So I'm Bryony, and I'm delighted to be here today with my colleague, Fiona Singh. And we are from World Cancer Research Fund International, who is a leading authority on the links between diet, nutrition, physical activity, and cancer. As an organization, we work collaboratively with others from around the world to encourage governments to implement policies to prevent cancer and other non-communicable diseases. And SSB taxes are one such policy. So we're going to talk about the state of play across Europe and also lessons learned from countries in Europe and globally who have implemented or attempted to implement an SSB tax. Oh, there we go. Okay, so currently 9 countries in Europe are implementing SSB taxes, which you can see here on this timeline. And as of our last nourishing update, we know that Estonia is in the process of planning an SSB tax, and France is planning on increasing their existing soda tax. And all of this information has come from our Nourishing Policy database, and more details about these taxes and others globally can be found there. And globally, over 45 jurisdictions are currently implementing SSB taxes, and a lot of that action has happened in the last several years, so momentum is definitely building. So there are a number of different types of SSB taxes, and most countries implement excise taxes. So there are 2 types of excise taxes, volumetric and nutrient or content-based. For volumetric taxes, this means that the tax is based on the volume of the beverage. So for example, 20 cents per liter. And for content-based, it's based on the sugar content of the beverage. So for example, 5 cents per gram of sugar. Here's a table outlining more specific detail about the SSB taxes that are being implemented in Europe. As you can see, 4 countries are implementing content-based excise taxes, and this type of tax is fairly recent and has been implemented in recent years, and we know that these are having effects on product reformulation. So companies are reformulating their projects in order to avoid a certain level of tax. So now we're going to move on and talk about what can be learned from countries who have implemented or attempted to implement SSB taxes to date. And a lot of what we'll be talking about from this point forward is from our first report in our Building Momentum series, which is focused on lessons on implementing a robust SSB tax, which we launched in June. And this report really seeks to provide advice to policymakers on how to design a robust SSB tax in the face of various challenges, which are caused by lack of political will and sometimes public will, and also due to industry interference. The report is underpinned by a review of the literature, as well as interviews that we conducted with 17 policymakers, advocates, and researchers globally who have been involved with SSB tax implementation. So we, in the report, identified 7 key elements to consider in developing an SSB tax. So first, it's important to take into consideration the local context. It's important to have a very strong evidence base to use it as a foundation for the design of the tax. It's very important to set clear policy objectives, to integrate monitoring and evaluation early on in the policy process so that the effects of the tax can be known. And then it's very important to carefully design the tax. And so I'll be going into more detail in the next slide about key questions to ask and answer there. And then also stakeholder engagement. So how to manage stakeholder engagement, different levels of the different departments of government, how to mobilize civil society organizations, and then also how and when to engage industry. And then lastly, how to frame an SSB tax in order to garner support. So drilling down into tax design, there are 5 key questions that need to be answered. Firstly, what types of products should be taxed? This is really key, and it needs to be transparent so all stakeholders can be aware of the reasoning as to which beverages are taxed and which are not. And so some countries use a nutrient profile in order to define what products should be taxed. Secondly, what type of tax should be used? Earlier, I presented the different types of tax that are available, and excise taxes are most commonly used as they are used with other commodities and are often already set up to be able to be used within a tax system. Thirdly, how high should the tax be? So the aim, of course, is for the tax to be high enough to impact purchasing behavior. And this is where M&E is really important, because if you find that after implementing an SSB tax that it's not affecting purchasing behavior, it may be that the tax isn't high enough, or it may be for other reasons, but so it's important to have it high enough. Fourthly, who should the tax be levied on? Here, it's important to tax as high as in the chain as possible. And this is to make it easier to collect the tax and to enforce it. And then lastly, should it be a general or an earmarked tax? Because research has shown that if the tax is earmarked, so for example, if the funds go towards a health promotion fund, it can garner additional public support for the tax. However, in reality, few constitutions allow for earmarking. So again, this goes back to understanding your local context to understand whether that is possible, because you don't want to promise something that turns out is not possible. So I'm going to pass on to Fiona.
So now we're going to look at common arguments against SSB taxes that governments often come up against when introducing and then implementing the SSB tax. So when interviewing and researching SSB tax implementation, we found that there were 7 main themes that the different arguments could be categorized into. The first 4 we'll look at here are legal challenges. The most common argument is that from stakeholders opposed to SSB taxes argue that if the tax only applies to certain products and not others, it's discriminatory and therefore unlawful. And this argument can occur when only international SSBs are taxed and not local SSBs. So to mitigate that risk, it's best practice to tax all SSBs in the same way. And we've seen that that has happened in places like the Pacific, where there are a lot of imported products, but the tax is applied to both local and imported. The second main legal argument is that the governments that are responsible for introducing the tax don't actually have the jurisdiction or the mandate to do so. And national governments do have the right to tax, and therefore this argument hasn't really been advanced in any country that we have seen. It can be relevant for local governments or municipalities introducing a tax. However, even there, in the case of Philadelphia and the States, the court has recently upheld that the City Council did have the right to tax SSBs. So this area is also looking promising. The third common legal argument is that the tax restricts on certain rights, such as rights to trade, commerce, or the right of the consumer, and therefore it's unconstitutional and unlawful. But this argument has not been made in any court by any jurisdiction, or any company has not taken any government to court over this issue. So yet it remains to be seen how strong this argument actually is. And the final legal argument is that the design of the tax is unclear or illogical and therefore unenforceable. To date, that argument hasn't actually been raised, apart from possibly in Cook County in the US, which has now been repealed. However, there are many other factors at play with the repeal of that tax. The following 3 arguments are not legal in nature, but they're common arguments that stakeholders often opposed to the tax use to derail the SSB tax implementation and sway the public and political opinion on the tax. First of all, the tax is often argued to be regressive, so it taxes a larger percentage of income from low-income earners rather than high-income earners. However, the Lancet Task Force on NCDs and Economics and research coming out of Deakin University by Professor Anna Peters has recently stated in response to this argument that NCDs are in fact regressive. The cost of healthcare related to NCDs is regressive. And studies show that low-income populations respond more to the price increases and reduce their demand. So the 6 challenges that it will hurt the economy. The tax will hurt the economy, cause job losses and impact on small businesses. And the research coming out of UNC, Professor Barry Popkin has found that there's no evidence to date that this has happened in reality. And finally, it is argued that SSB consumption is down to individual responsibility and should not be regulated by the government. And that is a common nanny state argument used with public health interventions. So the countries of jurisdictions that have implemented an SSB tax have navigated some or all of these arguments successfully and have had their response at hand and prepared. The 7 pillars of robust design mentioned earlier by Bryony has also been used by countries to design a tax that is defendable and can withstand these attacks. And for more specifics on these, you can read our Building Momentum report, which goes into more detail.
Great. Thank you, Fiona. So next, we're going to discuss some of the common, some of the lessons that have been learned from jurisdictions who have, again, implemented SSB taxes or attempted to, but have been unsuccessful, because the lessons can be learned from all such experiences. So for our report, we distilled these down into 6 themes. The first being, be prepared with evidence. And so it's really important to get evidence in line as early as possible. And many countries have heavily relied on evidence that has come out of Mexico and Berkeley, looking into the effects of those SSB taxes. Secondly, carefully consider the local context. And sorry, just going ahead before, Professor Melvin Freeman from the National Department of Health in South Africa, this is a quote that he provided to us. So just raising the importance of having all of your arguments together and to develop your counter arguments as well. So then, secondly, carefully consider the local context. So again, mentioned this before, but it's really important to have a thorough understanding of your local context, the tax system, and also the needs of the public before starting, in order to design an effective campaign and process and design an effective tax. Third, be strategic. So this is a lot of the time, there can be a lot of pressure to sort of move forward at speed. And so it's important not to rush it and to carefully consider a strategy that is coordinated, and oftentimes also to use the media, both paid and earned. And also a key lesson was to be honest and transparent about the tax. So for example, in some jurisdictions, don't shy away from the fact that the tax is going to increase the price of the tax beverages. Then develop a broad base of support. Both through academic support, civil society mobilization, and also to identify and to have a strong and influential champion in government on board, like Mayor Kenny in Philadelphia. And also that oftentimes to get funding from philanthropic organizations in order to support campaigns that are supporting SSB taxes. Because of the opposition that's often encountered, it's really important to be able to have these media campaigns supporting the tax. Next, scrutinize the tax design. So again, here, it's really important to identify any potential loopholes. So really looking at the tax design from the industry's perspective, and address any loopholes in order to make sure that the tax is designed in a way that it's clear and also enforceable. And then lastly, prepare for pushback and have your counter arguments ready. Based on nearly every jurisdiction globally, it's very clear that there's a very strong and mobilized opposition to SSB taxes. They are a contentious issue that have been hotly debated globally, and it continues to be a very interesting issue to follow, especially in the lead up to the UN high-level meeting. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So that's all for us today, but just to encourage everyone to take a look at our Building Momentum report as it outlines what we've covered in our presentation in more detail. So at this time, we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation, both of you. That was really interesting, and I encourage everybody to read and download the report, the Momentum report that they just mentioned. So we're running a bit short of time, so I'm just going to ask two very quick questions. The first one I'll ask is, where taxes have been implemented, are you aware of whether or not health was the driver of that tax being implemented, or whether there's other arguments that are actually driving the taxes?
So most of the time, it is health that's driving the development of the tax. And so it's often in reaction to a significant NCD problem in the country or high rates of overweight and obesity.
And we found that the most popular framing that had the most effect on increasing public support for the tax was a health framing as well. So there are other drivers, such in Philadelphia, they were just trying to raise revenue for social goods and for other public funds and public spending. And in that jurisdiction, that worked well, but it's generally a health framing does really help.
Okay, thank you for that. And one other question before we move on. What are your thoughts on taxing flavoured milk and unsweetened juices or artificially sweetened soft drinks?
So it depends on the jurisdiction. Some countries do tax these items and some do not. So France, for example, taxes both sweetened and beverages sweetened with artificial sweeteners. So it really depends on the jurisdiction. Globally, I think the evidence is still a bit unclear as to the impact of artificial sweeteners, but from my personal perspective, I think that if we are looking to help change people's taste preferences to wanting to consume less sweet things, then artificially sweetened beverages are not going to help with that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Very interesting area. And thanks both again for joining us today. We're going to now move on to Tim Lobstein from the World Obesity Federation. He's going to do our first presentation on a case study focusing on product tax in Hungary. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. Yes, I'd like to focus on the public health product tax in Hungary. And I'm actually depending heavily here on one particular pioneer, Eva Martos, who worked at the time for the National Institute for Health Development in Budapest, who's seen the pushing through of this adventure in Hungary, because it wasn't an easy task. If I can move this on, click, click, no. I'm not moving the screen. Why not? Okay. Okay, good. Someone did it. One of the precursor factors that led the Hungarians to consider this tax was the high level, as they perceived, a high level of consumption of soft drinks amongst Hungarian adults in their nutrition survey of 2009. Although the averages don't look very high, the consumption on a daily basis, particularly by younger people, half of younger people consuming soft drinks, nearly half on a daily basis amongst men and a third amongst women. And this was considered quite a sort of threat to health, but also an opportunity for revenue raising. So, am I moving on? No. Click to start the mouse. Okay. I have clicked. Or keep, okay, done it. And the proportion of soft drink consumers by nutritional status. This was another issue. If you can read along the bottom of this slide, you can see that amongst children, and these are 7- and 8-year-old children in the COSI study, consumption of soft drinks was particularly higher amongst overweight and particularly obese children with obesity. So this was obviously an issue that could be used to tackle the excess levels of obesity and overweight in these children. Yes, excellent. So, Public health product tax. Now, it's a nuanced title because it actually served two purposes. To promote healthier nutrition, yes. Encourage reformulation, that was a side effect which wasn't particularly intended, but to generate revenue, and specifically revenue for public health, for health services, aiming particularly to primary care and public health. So there was a double nuance in that public health product tax. Came into force in September 2011, been revised several times, and I'll show you a little what's that's meant, but primarily because the industry kept finding loopholes. It involved prepackaged non-core foods. Non-core means not foods that are recommended in nutrition guidelines for increased consumption, like fruit and veg, but are basically packaged and processed foods, which increased consumption is not recommended. And they only tax products where there was perceived to be easily available alternatives. In the case of soft drinks, that of course could be water or could be artificially sweetened soft drinks, but they also taxed a number of other products. Here's the, in fact, full list, which increased over the first 3 iterations of the tax. So coming in September 2011, there were 6 categories, increased to 7, 8, 9 categories in 2012, which they kept going and still keep going now. The main ones we're interested in today, of course, are the soft drinks, which they determined to be only taxable if it contained more than 8 grams of sugar per 100, 8% sugar levels, which includes, at the time, included nearly all the major soft drinks products, the cola drinks and so on. They also taxed soft drinks concentrates, that came in the following iteration, and energy drinks were also high level. Interestingly, the teaching community, school community, had lobbied hard to have energy drinks included. But we should note that they also included prepackaged products with added sugars, basically confectionery and chocolates and various other products. And also salt was on their target. So salted snacks, condiments with high salt levels, and so on were also included. The levels of tax, I think the little box at the bottom may not be easily visible, but basically 7 florins, Hungarian florins, is about 3 European cents, I think. So a litre of soft drinks would only attract, it's a fairly modest tax, 3-cent tax. Although we should remember that prices in Hungary are fairly low, incomes are fairly low, it's well below the European average. So that is probably a meaningful tax, and certainly it did, as we shall see, influence consumption. For a start, the sugary drinks and prepackaged sweets comprised about 40% of people's sugar intake. So this is how much sugar people were consuming in the pre-tax period, and how much of that was due to sugar-sweetened drinks or to prepackaged sweets. And you can see if you add the men up, it's about 44%, and the women 39%. So that's a fair proportion of their sugar, added sugar intake coming from these 2 product lines alone. So the tax was brought in 2011 and revised slightly in January 2012. Later in 2012, there was an impact assessment undertaken to see how consumption had changed. Overall consumer behavior had changed quite significantly, with at least, now I think these are percentages of consumers, so let's not get carried away at how much the products were reduced. 26% of consumers changed their behavior with regard to sugar-sweetened drinks, 27% with regard to prepackaged sweets. So not everyone made adjustments. Those that did, some reduced consumption by simply not buying so much, some switched to other products that were cheaper, and some, of course, went for the sort of healthier options. So there's a range of change behavior here. Of those that changed, let's have a look. Yes, of those that changed, they were re-questioned in 2014, 2 years later, and only a small proportion, the grey, were already back to the levels that they were before the taxes were introduced. So a small proportion drifted back up to their previous consumption levels. The large majority kept at a lower level, same from 2012 to 2014, and a fair proportion, 19% for soft drinks and 30% for confectionery, actually showed a further reduction in the 2 years following the introduction of the tax. So there was an impact, and it maintained and increased for some parts of the population. So there was an analysis done, the 2014 survey actually asked about how changes made in relation to individuals' weight status. And it's interesting to see that those who were overweight or were experiencing obesity were actually more likely to change their behavior, more likely to show a response to the tax in the right direction. So we see that rising from 14% from under or normal weight through to 25, 21% for soft drinks, this is, for people with overweight or obesity. So that was an interesting and valuable finding. It was, if you like, targeting where it needed to target from a public health perspective. There's also an analysis done on socioeducational status, in fact by education status, showing that if anything, it affected those of lower educational status more than it affected those with a higher educational status. This is probably because, in fact, lower educational status were the higher consumers. So it's really a volumetric response in the sense that those who consume most responded most. But it's interesting to see that that is the direction and the direction one would expect to find. So we can draw some lessons from this. An excellent WHO report in 2015 drew up some of the conclusions, which were a fiscal instrument, taxing soft drinks and indeed taxing snacks and confectionery as well, can effectively improve nutrition behavior of the population. Public can accept a tax directed, particularly if it is spoken of and the narrative is about health service improvements. Improved nutrition literacy was an unintended beneficial consequence. That is, the publicity surrounding the introduction of the tax actually increased, in the surveys that were done, increased public literacy and understanding of what was healthy and what was unhealthy in their diets. And there was some reformulation. So healthier products were generally available due to product reformulation, which is a benefit, obviously, for all, not just for those who are making changes in response to the tax. So if there's a healthier product reformulation generally, the whole population should benefit from that. And that in itself will give a further fiscal advantage. If the population are eating a healthier diet, one would hope there would be a reduced demand on health services. Secondly, we have to remember that continuous refinement of the legislation is essential. In order that loopholes come up, industry was very good at finding little ways they could get around some of the taxes. So in fact, there have been 5 iterations of this legislation trying to close some of those loopholes. It should be recognized, and perhaps this helps answer one of the questions that came up near the beginning, the tax is not a silver bullet. It is not alone going to address poor nutrition or indeed a budget shortfall. It is one of a range of measures that are all needed, including the change of narrative itself, to ensure that the population has better access to and more likely to consume a healthy diet. So let's not rely on this alone, but it is one of a range of measures. Further lesson, intersectoral action enabled accurate problem definition. That's to say, it wasn't just the Ministry of Health, it wasn't just the Treasury, it wasn't just community education or any other particular department. It was a cross-government sectoral development. So it was important that policy solutions are across government. And there was a testing of the law. When it was first being proposed, the industry took the Hungarian government to the European Commission and said that this was illegal. But as our previous presenters described, this was actually ruled out. The Commission demanded various facts and statements from the Hungarians to justify the tax. The Hungarians could show that it was not discriminatory against, for example, importers or against particular parts of the industry. It was going to be applied across the board. And the Commission then ruled in the Hungarian Parliament's favour, and the Act went through. I think I'm nearing the end. I want to recommend 2 particular documents if you're interested in the Hungarian experience. The first one, as I say, from WHO in 2015, and indeed a second follow-up one published later that year, which has the second round of assessment details in it. For 2015. Both of those are worth looking at. And a third one you might want to look at, undertaken for the Health Equity Project, that funded by the European Commission, looked at the impact of junk food taxes in Hungary, particularly through the lens of inequalities and social educational status issues. And I've given the web connection there. So I think that's me sorted. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. That was very interesting, particularly the comments on whose behaviour changed the most. It was interesting that there's been a lot of reiterations of this policy. Do you think that was because of the intersectoral kind of collaboration on this policy, or was there a particular person or government institution that was been pushing and committed to it?
It needed further iterations. I mean, it was launched by the, Health Ministry, but as I say, across sectoral, it had Treasury involvement too. It needed iterations primarily. Firstly, to ratchet up the tax a little, but not a lot. I think chocolates particularly had an increase, and salty snacks had an increase over the first couple of years. But primarily to include a few extra categories and to close some loopholes. And as I said earlier, the loopholes were probably the most tricky things to tackle, because when you try to define exactly what you mean by this food or that food, it can be quite tricky. It's not always clear whether a food is a snack or is a savory part of a meal or whatever. And all these things had to be defined quite carefully. And that's where the iterations have had to come in.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here. Are there any studies on whether soda taxes make consumers change from expensive brands to cheaper brands when the price rises? So for instance, in Norway, there's a very cheap alternative to Fanta, which is about a third of the price. So is there a risk that taxes just make people change their preferences rather than actually reduce their overall consumption?
Yes, a proportion of those who change their behavior simply bought cheaper foods. That is in the second report from WHO. It's worth going back to look at it. It did affect a proportion of those who changed their behavior. They simply switched to cheaper products. And you could argue that that's actually potentially problematic if the quality of those products is less good in some respect, maybe higher levels of additives or some other way in which you don't want them to be consumed in greater quantity. So a switch alone is actually not going to make much of a public health difference. But the tax will still be collected, so to some extent, the government's targets for tax collection might be maintained.
Okay, thank you. I think we're running out of time, so we're going to move on now, but thank you very much for that presentation. And if anyone has any other questions for Tim, hopefully we'll have some time at the end after our final two presentations. So I'm going to move on to Kautha Hashim now from Action on Sugar, which is a UK-based independent lobby and research group, and she's going to be talking us through the UK's experience of implementing a soda tax and the impact that this has, particularly on product reformulation.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to be taking you through a quick tour around what the UK's unique, very unique tax in terms of reformulation. So briefly about us, our flagship has always been to encourage reformulation, but we've also been supportive of other actions that will reduce sugar intake, So to start off, we launched in 2014, and in the beginning it was important to look at what is contributing the most to sugar intake in the UK population. And basically it was quite clear that soft drinks was a key contributor to sugar intake in the UK population, particularly in teenagers. And since
Sorry, Kautha, you're breaking up a bit. Can you just try and keep the microphone close to your mouth when you talk, please?
So let me just go back one slide. Are you able to do that for me, Hannah? Okay, so I'll just repeat this slide. So we started off by looking at what was the key contributor to sugar intake in the UK population. It was really clear that soft drinks is one of the key contributors. And we looked at, for example, that within teenagers, 40% of sugar was coming through soft drinks. I'm just going to move the slide now. And we started off by launching a campaign looking at the sugar levels of soft drinks. So we started looking at carbonated drinks, then moved on to juices and juice drinks. And basically, we played a really key role in raising the awareness among consumers by using the press around the levels of sugar in soft drinks. And I think that really played a huge role, because we've had for many years many organizations calling for a sugar tax or a soda tax in the UK. But I think this really helped build the momentum to bring about what we ended up with, our type of tax. So that was in 2014, and then in 2015 we looked at other types of drinks such as energy drinks. Hannah, if you could move my slide, please. So we looked at, for example, energy drinks. We found products that contained up to 20 teaspoons of sugar. That's about 3 times the maximum intake in the UK. This was also during the time that the recommendation of total sugar intake in the UK was reduced to only 5% of your energy intake. And so we always tried to compare that level to what was available in supermarkets in single portions. And so what we ended up recommending to government was 3 key recommendations. The first one is around reformulation, not just in soft drinks, but also in the other key categories that are contributing to high sugar intake. And so that was around reformulation, so incremental reduction in sugar content. And then the next one is around promotions and advertising. So we wanted to focus on allowing only or pushing for only healthy products to be promoted and advertised. And the third one, which is basically very much in line with what other NGOs were calling for in the UK, was around a soda tax, but also we've extended it to include confectionery. And the idea is that these types of measures collectively, we estimated, could reduce total calorie intake to 250 to 300 calories per person per day, being that that is the amount that is potentially could prevent the increases in overweight and obesity. Not to treat the 62% of the population that are already overweight or obese. Next slide, please. So we, in 2016, after a lot of push, we've had celebrity support from Jamie Oliver. He had a TV program during a TV program that pushed for it. We were doing our press releases looking at sugar levels in these types of products, and other NGOs were looking at the gains, for example, potential revenue generated. Finally, the government decided that they were going to launch a sugar tax. But this is very different, I believe, to what other countries have piloted or introduced. And this is basically on the industry themselves. What NGOs were calling for here is a tax on the final product. And what we were calling for is introducing a tax, but also encouraging reformulation. And so what the government decided to do is to combine the two. And essentially, they introduced a tax at 2 bands, and it's on the companies themselves. So if you were a company producing soft drinks that are below 5% sugar, you would be not taxed. But if it exceeded the 5%, was between 5 and 8%, you were taxed at 18p per litre. And if it was above 8%, then you were taxed at 24p per litre. And the idea is that companies would be gradually pushed and given 2 years window. So it was announced in 2016, it was going to be implemented in 2018. A 2-year window for them to change their formulations to avoid paying the tax, or to go to the lower band and pay less of the tax or the levy, or pay none of it at all, escape it completely. So to give you an idea, all the cola products in the UK were about 11% sugar. So they already had to make a significant reduction to avoid the levy. So I think the term is really important, because this is, it is a soda tax. I think that would be a correct description. But the common media term that was used in the UK was that is a sugar tax, it's a sugar levy or a sugar duty. But essentially, it's not all of those things. It's a soft drinks industry levy. It's on the industry, it's not on the consumer. But I will talk later about how that can be pushed, passed on to the consumer. So very quickly, we started to see that companies started to respond and change their formulations way in advance of the introduction of the levy. So we had Tesco announcing that all their own label products, the products that are branded as Tesco products, were already below the levy threshold, so they were below 5% sugar. And then we had really big iconic brands, British brands such as Lucozade, reducing to avoid paying the levy altogether. Some people were slightly unhappy with that change. Some people didn't notice that change, and so I think that was significant. I think it's significant because of how quickly that change was done. So the impact from the very recent report from Public Health England, where they're evaluating not just the impact of the levy, but also the impact of the reformulation program on sugar, which is a completely different thing. But they're evaluating this, and they've purchased huge amounts of data from Kantar World Panel to see the impact of this levy. And so they've got data, baseline data from 2015, and they evaluated it against data from 2017. And already sugar levels in soft drinks have come down by 11%. And that's only in 2 years. And also the average calories in single portions has come down by 6%. And there is a clear shift in volumes towards products with lower levels of sugar, so below the levy threshold, which is the 5%, the 5 grams per 100 mils. So a huge impact. And here is a distribution graph that is from Public Health England's report that shows what the distribution was in 2015 and then in 2017. And then also, I mean, you could see the second spike where the 10% sugar is. You could see that the spike was much higher in 2015 than it is now, than it was in 2017. And bear in mind that the levy hadn't been introduced yet, so companies were reducing levels, but they weren't paying the levy yet. This was all in preparation for the levy that came into force in April this year. So what you also could see is the dotted line. There was a shift to the left. So, oops, can you go back, please? So there was a shift to the left. The dotted line shows that the levels were the average levels of sugar was in 2015, and then a shift to the left, so reducing levels on average in 2017. Next slide, please. So based on data we've collected, and since cola is one of the most popular flavors sold in the UK, these are all the different types of cola products that you could find on supermarket shelves. We've compared the levels before the levy came into force. So we have data from 2014. We compared it to the levels that were in 2017. And you can see some significant reductions, top one being the Tesco product. But we still had, or we still have probably, some products that are not coming down, and they still maintain the levels. And these are the popular brands that you could see too over there. There is that risk, is that some companies don't want to reformulate their products and reduce levels of sugar. So I'm going to talk about what are the gains of this soft drinks industry levy and what are the potential outcomes so far. And the first one is that it's essentially brought about reformulation, a sugar reduction, unobtrusive. Some consumers haven't noticed this. It's not regressive, as previously described by other speakers. And actually, some consumers haven't noticed, and there hasn't been a change in there's no required change in their consumer habits, because some of them have just continued to buy the same products, not realizing that these are lower in sugar. Now, on the other side is that since there is an easy solution for soft drinks companies, and that is sweeteners, different types of sweeteners, they're not necessarily all going to have the same impact. Some of them haven't been tested in the human diet for long enough. But the risk is that they're maintaining the sweetness in these products. So they usually they use the high sugar products as the benchmark for the flavor. And so they will use, when they're trying to reduce the sugar, will try and compare it or maintain that taste. So there's potentially no reduction in sweetness, although we're told that some brands have reduced sweetness gradually. There is an increase in sweetener use, and there is more emerging evidence depending on which type of sweetener has been used and the risk of that. And then, of course, it excludes, so it's only focused, for example, this levy on carbonated drinks, energy drinks, but it excludes milk-based drinks and also fruit juices, but it does include juice drinks. So those that have a bit of juice, a bit of sugar, a bit of sweetener, those types of products will still be included. So the risk is that some companies will not reduce sugar and pass the cost on to the consumer. Not reducing the sugar levels and paying the levy is, a big disincentive for the company. But passing it on to the consumers makes it a disincentive for the consumer. But when initially this type of levy was to be introduced, it wasn't about passing it on to the consumers, but essentially it was a choice for the companies to make. And there was a lot of discussion, particularly with Coca-Cola, when they were asked by the Health Select Committee in the UK, which is a group of MPs, where they questioned them about what do they think they're going to do about this extra cost on the company. They said they will try and retrieve it somehow. And the focus or the risk was that they would increase the price of both the lower sugar versions of their products, but also the high sugar versions of their products. And since people anticipated that that could happen, there was some sort of push that the price differentiation between lower sugar products and high sugar products should be maintained, and that if they were to pass on the cost to consumers, that they should only increase the price of the high sugar products. And that is essentially what's happened. So it's now acted as a disincentive also for the consumer, and that potentially so there are two levels to this. It's encouraged companies to reduce levels of sugar, and those that haven't, there is a slight price increase. And so going forward, what we are thinking about is to push companies further to reformulate, and I think that's really important, is potentially to escalate these levies over time, so increase them gradually, just similar to tobacco taxes that have increased over time. And that's very quickly. I hope you heard it throughout and that there was no issues with my internet connection. And if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Kautha. That was very interesting. I do have one question, actually, which I'll ask first. You've said that the companies have reformulated their products, which essentially means a lot of them are paying less tax than perhaps was originally intended. Has the UK government reassessed what they're expecting to make in terms of revenue from this tax?
Yeah, I think so initially, I can't recall what the exact figure, but it's probably about half what they estimated to gain from it. And I should have added that what has enabled some support or greater support for the introducing this levy is that this money was going to be given only to schools for breakfast clubs and also to increase physical activity of children. So I think that was important. But what they initially promised to invest in that area, they are still going to be investing that, but the money is going to be coming from elsewhere, not just from the revenue, because what they're going to raise is going to be lower than what they estimated.
Okay, well, that's good to hear that there's still going to be as much money, in theory, going to the schools. And building on the question that we had for Tim previously, have you done any surveys where you've looked at the sugar content of products in relation to cost or any of the changes? Yeah.
We haven't, but I think so the government's already commissioned I think colleagues in Oxford University to do a big evaluation of all the different aspects of this the introduction of the levy, and I think price is going to be a significant part of their evaluation, and we should, I think, 2 years, and then eventually we'll be able to see what's happened on that.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask one more question before we move on, and then we can address the others at the end. Do you think that targeting industry to change formulation is a more effective approach for influencing health outcomes compared to other approaches, such as targeting the consumers directly to reduce their consumption? Or do you think they need to go hand in hand?
I think they do go hand in hand, but it will take a much longer time to just focus on consumers. Essentially, they're choosing products that are on supermarket shelves and influencing the companies. As you can see, within 2 years, even before the introduction of the levy, huge reductions have been made. I don't recall there's that many other policies that have such a big impact in such a short period of time.
Okay, and I'm actually going to ask one more question because I think it's quite relevant to the UK. Do you think without the celebrity promotion, we would have seen the same change or the introduction of this tax?
I think it was really important to have celebrity support. I think also, I think the UK context is very unique potentially because the way we've worked with the media is probably not open in other countries. It's not an option in other countries, and I think that's had a huge momentum. But I mean, all this has happened in the last 4 years. Before that, there wasn't that much discussion about sugar, and it's in the last 4 years that we've had this huge momentum, and many people in Parliament.
Okay, thank you, Kauthra. And I think that's a good note to end on, to remember that there is national context differences, and that when you are looking to implement a tax, wherever you are in Europe or in the world, to consider what factors might be important where you are. So we're now going to move on to our final speaker, Pamela Naidoo from South Africa. And she's going to be talking to us about South African experience, which is a really interesting example that's coming quite recently of implementing taxes. So Pamela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you all for being present today. I think my presentation is really well positioned because South Africa has many unique features, and you'll see how the context actually influences the specific types of taxes, not just here in South Africa, and how you can really take this lesson to other countries. Hannah, I am going to be, will I be changing my slides or will you be? Okay, I want to go on to the next slide. Okay, there we go. So if I could just have the next slide, there we go. Right, so the reason I've put all my affiliations down is I think that it really is a good way of demonstrating how I might be the CEO of the Heart and Stroke Foundation South Africa, but I also hold a position in Africa as president of the African Heart Network, and then I'm a researcher myself, and I continue my academic work. I think it's a really good way of, when you're heading a foundation or an organization that is advocacy driven or policy driven, when you wear a few hats, it actually makes your work a little bit more powerful. And I certainly have found that in the context of the sugar sweetened beverage tax. It's really been quite a powerful experience in the country. Okay, there we go. So what I would really like to do is to contextualize this presentation within a public health framework, which I think, most of the speakers have said so, but I would like to really zone in on the non-communicable diseases burden, because in South Africa, I think really this is what drove the Minister of Health to push for the sugar-sweetened beverage tax, and it's what made Treasury listen. Now, if we look globally, the World Health Organization considers the 4 main non-communicable diseases to be cardiovascular disease, heart disease and stroke, which is my particular bias at the foundation. And then, of course, there's cancers, diabetes, and chronic respiratory diseases. Now, the world over, 38 million people die from non-communicable diseases annually, and of these, 16 million will die prematurely before the age of 70. Now, over 80% of premature deaths occur in low and middle income countries. South Africa is technically what we would consider an upper middle income country, despite the fact that we have many inequalities within country. Now, premature deaths are mainly due to 4 modifiable behavioral risk factors, and I think this is really critical to what I think Tim mentioned earlier, that the sugar-sweetened beverage tax is not a silver bullet. We need to really look at a basket of tools to be able to shift behavior. And these risk factors are tobacco smoking, harmful use of alcohol, physical inactivity, and unhealthy diet. So the World Health Organization expects ministries around the world to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, based on the statistics burden, non-communicable diseases poses a major challenge to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And in particular, as we all know, is the SDG 3 that we're particularly interested in, and that's to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Now, so consequently, ministries are expected to enact the WHO Global NCD's Action Plan 2013 to 2020. And so I think that a lot of what we're talking about today really needs to be seen in that context too. It's governments around the world that they have to commit to reducing NCD's burden. So if we look specifically at unhealthy eating, which is a common risk factor for many NCDs, we all know it leads to overweight and obesity, which in turn drives the 4 main NCDs that I mentioned earlier. Now, evidence shows that a whole of government approach to reduce risk for non-communicable diseases by influencing manufacturing and purchasing behavior is urgently called for. And your key interventions are really at policy level, coherence between trade and health policies, labor, tax, urban planning, education, and so on. Now, if you look specifically at South Africa, we've got the proportion of total deaths by category 1997 to 2014. It's a source from Statistics South Africa. Now, for many of you, you will probably be aware that we share, we do a lot of good things, but we also boast a lot of burden of disease in a way. So it's not a nice thing, but we've just inherited, as you know, one of the biggest burdens of communicable diseases in the world due to HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis. So if you look at this graph, you can see that actually your communicable diseases or deaths from communicable diseases is slightly on the decline. For non-communicable diseases, it's actually now overtaking communicable diseases, and it's sitting close to about 50% of total deaths. The unfortunate thing in South Africa is that we actually also have to consider the comorbidities. So we really do sit with a relatively high burden of both communicable and an increasing burden of non-communicable diseases. Right, so if we look at I want to just now focus on policy intervention, and in South Africa, a case for the sugar-sweetened beverage tax. Now, if we look at the evidence, we've spoken about this in one of the previous presentations. Taxes on alcohol and tobacco has been in existence for a long while, but that was primarily to raise government revenue. Of late, however, the focus has shifted to utilizing the revenue raised from alcohol and tobacco and other unhealthy products like foods high in sugar, fat, and so on for public health gains. Now, we all, we talk about the evidence, and it's obviously, as a scientist myself, I mean, it is rather critical. But, so there is overwhelming evidence, but the one article that comes to mind by Wright et al. In 2017, they conducted a systematic review on policy lessons from health taxes. Now, what we found in the outcome of this paper is that the most significant finding is the following. In high-income countries, studies were focused on food products which demonstrated that high taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages are likely to have a positive impact on health behaviors and outcomes. Taxes reduce demand but add fiscal revenue. Now, the authors recommend that if the primary policy goal of a health tax is to reduce consumption of unhealthy products, then evidence supports the implementation of taxes that increase the price of products by 20% or more. That's quite an important factor to just remember, just to keep that at the back of your minds for the rest of this presentation. Now, if you look at the history in South Africa, what is the background to our SSB tax? So the proposals for the SSB tax were announced in 2016 in South Africa. And South Africa has the highest rate of obesity in sub-Saharan Africa, with women having almost twice the rate as men. So you have women sitting at 70% versus men at 40%. Now, obviously, if this is utilizing the BMI, that is a little bit controversial at the moment. Should it be the primary indicator of overweight and obesity? But to keep the standardized global measure, we'll just leave it at that. But I think in South Africa, there is a little bit of a debate about, whether we should be using BMI and we should be adding actually, weight, height ratio, and so on. But be that as it may, we do have a problem with obesity. Now, the South African government set out targets to reduce obesity by 10% by 2020, with the SSB tax as but one of the tools to achieve this. So the SSB tax debate reached Parliament in early 2017, and presentations were made by many interest groups, including civil society groups. So the Heart and Stroke Foundation South Africa is part of the NCD's Alliance South Africa, but also part of the NCD's Alliance globally. So I was also in Parliament presenting as part of civil society. And then the other example I want to use is Section 27. So people can contact me if they want to know more. But I think the Section 27 is a really important civil society group in our country. It's driven by Legal Eagles. And I think that the HIV, we've learned from HIV lesson, we've learned many lessons from HIV, including Section 27 and how they mobilized and really, in a good way, force government to provide access to care for HIV infected people. So Section 27 is a powerful group together with our treatment action campaign. So these are all really very powerful groups that mobilize in South Africa. The other groups obviously were industry, trade unions, and other public and private sector organizations, including the sugar industry, of course. Now, the World Health Organization was present, and they stated that South Africa could prevent an estimated 500,000 deaths over 40 years by introducing and implementing the sugar-sweetened beverage tax. Hannah, if I could have the next slide, please. Right, so at this point, South Africa was still considering a 20% tax on the evidence of great impact with higher taxes. I've mentioned the study done earlier, and really 20% was kind of like the minimum percentage. Now, WHO's Dr. Timo Vakwanivalu said, a child eating a burger and chips washed down with a sugary drink and followed by crisps and a chocolate bar would have to run half a marathon to get rid of these effects. You cannot out-exercise a bad diet. Now, other arguments in favor of the sugar-sweetened beverage tax were that it's the cheapest intervention. Our very own economist in South Africa, Karen Hoffmans, argued that the sugar-sweetened beverage tax is the cheapest intervention to prevent obesity, and a 20% tax could potentially prevent 280,000 people from becoming obese. She also noted that between 1995 and 2015, South Africa saw a 50% increase in treating obesity among the 54 to 69-year-olds. And I mean, this is the age group, this cohort is also most vulnerable to the onset of many NCDs. Now, a good example of impact on behavior change in our country was tobacco tax, which facilitated a reduction in smoking prevalence from 40% to 20% among adults. I think Robert Martin alluded to this earlier. Now, other arguments in favor of the sugar-sweetened beverage tax were another public health specialist only stated that obesity is linked to lower cognitive function in children and raised the concern that in South Africa, 9 to 10-year-olds are amongst the highest consumers of sugary drinks in the world, coming second only to United States, the children from the US. Another endocrinologist, Dr. Ruda, who was very passionate about his presentation, he called this psychological manipulation and stated that the marketing of sugary drinks is psychological manipulation to make us consume things we might not need at all.
Pamela, we are actually running out of time, so if you could just kind of rapidly go through your last slides and maybe focus on some of the learnings for other people, that would be great.
Yeah,
and then we've got time for questions. Oh,
yeah,
are you?
Almost at the last ones, yeah. If you could just quickly flip through and I'll just pick out the most important. Right, so just to continue, the endocrinologist Ruda then said, 1 sugary drink a day increases your chance of obesity by 25%. It's obviously causing problems in the public health system where clinicians are really overburdened. Now, I think that there are no job losses. You know, that is the argument that's often posed by industry. And we had a professor from the US who then used the Mexico example to say there were no job losses when they, you know, introduced taxes in Mexico in 2013. But a very quick story I would like to relay is that industry in South Africa even imported scientists to this parliamentary hearing to convince on the other side of the argument. And these were scientists. And I think this is perhaps what we should all go away with. You have scientists who say there's overwhelming evidence for the sugar-sweetened beverage tax, and then you will get scientists who let us down and pose the opposite argument. The next slide, please, Hannah. So we had civil society groups obviously wanting to subsidize healthy, government to subsidize healthy foods as well. And I think the Treasury made a good point that we need a basket of interventions. Hannah, if I could go to the next slide, I think it comes to, that's just telling you that the industry's argument, how much they contribute to the GDP of South Africa, which is about $4 billion US, and they estimated their job losses to be up to 24,000. Next slide, please. Right, in South Africa, we've actually now called it the Health Promotion Levy. We did introduce this in April 2013. And the idea, but we're trying to mobilize government to actually utilize that government specifically as it is stated. So to use it for campaigns and to fund foundations who do this type of work, health promotion. Next slide, please. So our current tax is actually sitting at 11% and not 20%. So we didn't get our best buy. We want to mobilize towards that. So it's a good fight that we continue. The first 4 grams is tax-free. Milk and 100% fruit juices are exempt. Next slide, please. And just in conclusion then, I think I'm very happy to say that in Africa, we're the first country to adopt the SSB tax. And because I hold, quite a key position in Africa for NCDs and CVDs, I really would like to take this fight to the rest of Africa. We've got other countries who obviously we've talked about, and we've shown how important it is to actually look at this as one of the best buys, which does make a change on behavior. Next slide, please, which I think would then be the second last, and then I'm almost there. I think this is an important quotation from the economist Stacey this year, also a South African, who says, using years of life gained due to avoided premature mortality, states that the current tax of 11% is predicted to result in a gain of over 300,000 life years over a 30-year period. But if you had a 20% tax, it actually could double this, resulting in 688,719 life years gained. And I would think that that actually is my last slide. So yeah, sorry about the rush presentation, but I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Pamela, and sorry to rush you at the end there. Unfortunately, it's commonly the case if you're the last speaker. I know a lot of you have asked questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to address them as we are already running a little bit over. But what I'll do is, where possible, I'll try and link you up with the relevant speakers and try and get your questions asked. Pamela, just to end, if I could just ask you, if someone came to you from a country that doesn't currently have a sugar tax, and said to you, Pamela, what do we need to do to get a sugar tax in our country? What would your #1 piece of advice be?
I would say the primary analysis would have to be looking at your burden of disease, because I think governments also want to put their money into where is the highest burden. And for us, because we saw the increasing burden of NCDs and obesity being one of the major risk factors, I think that was the strongest argument from the Minister of Health. So your Minister of Health is your key person.
Thank you very much, Pamela. That's useful to know. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. And thank you to all of our speakers. We will be putting this webinar up online. So if you want to go back and look at the slides or re-listen to any of the presentations, you're more than welcome. And I'll send a link out in the next couple of days. So thank you very much, and look out for future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.